Nancy Pelosi had survived decades of relentless political warfare, but in exactly 23 minutes, she was about to be completely dismantled by Tulsi Gabbard and a single manila folder. Nancy Pelosi had endured it all. From navigating 2 presidential impeachments to surviving a horrific home invasion that left her husband severely injured, she had weathered the collapse of her party's majority and 4 decades of ruthless maneuvering in the most vicious political arena on earth. She had stared down commanders-in-chief, buried her rivals, and outlasted every single challenger who had ever tried to dismantle her legacy. Yet, despite her formidable resilience, she had never faced a number she could not justify. That number was $280 million. And very soon, a military veteran carrying a simple manila folder and a bottle of water was going to place that staggering figure on a table for 300 million Americans to see, demanding to know its origin. Pelosi would have no defense. In fact, she would never have a defense again. 4 hours prior, the line snaking outside room 2154 of the Rayburn House office building stretched far past the elevators, wrapping down the long corridor and spilling around the corner into the stairwell. Capitol Police had meticulously arranged rope barricades to manage the unprecedented crowd. CNN had their broadcast graphics primed, reading, "Pelosi testifies on stock trading." Fox News had a bolder banner ready, "Pelosi Insider Trading Hearing Live." Every single camera lens in Washington was locked onto one specific room, and every individual present understood they were about to witness a historic moment. They simply had no idea just how historic it would become. Tulsi Gabbard made her entrance at 8:45 inches the morning. She arrived entirely alone. There was no sprawling entourage, no frantic communications director, and no swarm of eager staffers hauling boxes of redacted documents. She was dressed sharply in a dark navy blazer over a crisp white blouse. She wore no jewelry, no decorative lapel pins, absolutely nothing designed to catch the glare of the camera lights. In her hands, she carried precisely one folder and one bottle of water. She took her seat quietly, opened the folder, and waited in silence. For those unfamiliar with her background, the essential facts were profound. Born in American Samoa and raised in Hawaii, she enlisted in the Hawaii Army National Guard at the age of 21, driven by a deeply held conviction that if a politician votes to send citizens to war, they must be willing to deploy themselves. She deployed to the combat zones of Iraq, served on the front lines as a medical specialist, returned home, successfully ran for Congress, served 4 consecutive terms, launched a presidential campaign, ultimately left the Democratic Party, and in February of 2025 was confirmed as the Director of National Intelligence. She was the very first female combat veteran to occupy that high office. She had sat in far more dangerous rooms than this one. She had been in rooms where human lives were actively slipping away. Nancy Pelosi made her entrance at 9:02 inches the morning. She did not utilize the discreet side entrance. Nancy Pelosi had never utilized a side entrance in her entire life. She strode commandingly through the main double doors, flanked by 4 dedicated staffers, her seasoned communications director, and a high-powered attorney from Williams & Connolly, one of the most exorbitantly priced legal firms in the nation's capital. She was adorned in a pristine cream Chanel blazer, accented by flawless Mikimoto pearls. She offered a practiced, radiant smile to the flashing cameras. She waved to a fellow politician seated in the second row, moving with the deeply ingrained grace of a woman who had been commanding hearing rooms since before many of the attendees had even been born. With 38 years in Congress, 2 tenures as Speaker of the House, and the distinction of being the only woman to ever wield the Speaker's gavel, her resume was staggering. She had orchestrated the passage of the Affordable Care Act, spearheaded 2 historic presidential impeachments, endured a targeted home invasion, and amassed a personal financial empire that rivaled the very Wall Street hedge fund executives she was tasked with regulating. She took her seat, deliberately adjusted her microphone, and gazed down at Gabbard with the distinct expression of a monarch inspecting a peasant who had foolishly wandered into the royal court. And then she launched her offensive. Director Gabbard, Pelosi initiated, speaking before the committee chairman had even struck the gavel to open the session. Her tone carried the heavy, unmistakable authority of 4 decades of absolute, unquestioned power. I sincerely hope today will be vastly more productive than your previous appearance before this legislative body. I seem to recall your brief presidential campaign. What was the final polling number? 1%? And then you abandoned the party simply because you could not secure a victory. You switched allegiances. And now you sit before us in a position granted to you by a man I personally impeached twice, harboring the delusion that you are somehow qualified to lecture me regarding ethics. She smiled. It was the precise, calculating smile that had prematurely ended countless political careers. I have commanded more congressional hearings than you have spent actual days serving in Congress. I have stared down presidents who made your current superior look like an absolute amateur. So whatever trivial accusations you believe you possess in that little folder of yours, Director, let us dispense with them quickly. Some of us have serious legislative work to attend to. Laughter immediately erupted from the Democratic side of the aisle. It was loud, confident laughter, the specific sound that echoes when allies believe a battle has been won before the first shot is even fired. Pelosi's staff exchanged arrogant smirks. Several journalists seated in the press gallery began rapidly typing out what they presumed would be the defining narrative of the day. Veteran politician schools junior appointee. CNN's control room had a backup graphic ready to air. Pelosi puts Gabbard in her place. The entire room was laughing right alongside Pelosi. In exactly 10 minutes, that same room would be laughing at her. But absolutely no one knew that yet. No one, that is, except the composed woman sitting motionlessly at the witness table with a single folder and a bottle of water. Pelosi was not finished. She rarely was. She sensed blood in the water and was determined to strike. You know, Director, I vividly remember when you were a member of my caucus. I remember when you sat quietly in my strategy meetings, when you consistently voted alongside my party. And then, the moment it became politically convenient, when you flatlined at 1% and failed to secure a single meaningful endorsement, you simply walked away. You did not leave on a matter of principle. You left driven entirely by naked ambition. So, I ask that you please spare me this tedious moral authority act. I was fighting tirelessly in the trenches for working American families, while you were still trying to decide which political party would tolerate your presence. More laughter echoed. Louder applause followed. Progressive activists seated in the upper gallery nodded in vigorous agreement. This was the razor-sharp Nancy Pelosi they fiercely admired. Lethal, precise, and utterly untouchable. She had executed this exact maneuver 1,000 times before. She had dismantled 1,000 eager opponents, utilizing that precise alchemy of elite condescension and tactical political brutality. She had absolutely no idea. She had just confidently signed her own political death warrant. Tulsi Gabbard said nothing. 15 agonizing seconds passed. Then 20 seconds, she calmly arranged the printed documents inside her folder, took a slow, deliberate sip of water, and refused to break her downward gaze. Pelosi, misinterpreting the silence as a sign of submission, pressed her advantage even harder. Perhaps, Director, if you spent a little less time hopping between political parties and a little more time studying how the federal government actually operates. Are you quite finished, Madam Speaker? Tulsi finally looked up. Her voice was remarkably quiet. It was the deeply controlled, chillingly steady voice of a leader who had delivered far worse news in far bloodier places. Someone who had learned long ago that raising your volume is entirely unnecessary when you possess undeniable facts. Because you just brought up the concept of service, and I happen to have several pressing questions regarding how exactly you have served, specifically how you managed to become extraordinarily wealthy while allegedly serving the public. The triumphant smile vanished from Pelosi's face. It did not fade gradually. It disappeared instantaneously, like a severed power line. She had just committed the most catastrophic miscalculation of her 40-year political career. She had insulted the wrong combat veteran, openly mocked the wrong soldier, instigated the wrong conflict, and she was seconds away from discovering the sheer magnitude of her error. Tulsi opened the manila folder. She methodically extracted 4 distinct documents and arranged them side by side upon the wooden table. She moved with the precise, practiced hands of a trauma surgeon, laying out stainless steel instruments, each item in its specific place, each item serving a lethal purpose. The entire room watched in breathless silence. I want to begin strictly with dates and dollars. She stated evenly. No political opinions, no baseless accusations, just a verifiable timeline. The American people are perfectly capable of drawing their own conclusions. July of 2021. Your husband, Paul Pelosi, executes a massive purchase of between $1 million and $5 million in NVIDIA call options. During that exact time frame, the CHIPS Act, historic legislation actively directing $52 billion of taxpayer funds directly into the domestic semiconductor manufacturing industry, was steadily making its way through your specific chamber of Congress. You were the sitting Speaker of the House. You held absolute control over which pieces of legislation reached the floor for a vote. When investigative reporters inquired about this miraculously timed trade, your official spokesperson issued a statement. I am quoting directly from the permanent public transcript. The Speaker does not own any stocks and has absolutely no prior knowledge or subsequent involvement in any financial transactions. She paused, lifting her eyes to meet Pelosi's. You do not own stocks. Your husband owns the stocks. You have been legally married since 1963. You share a primary residence, a sprawling vineyard, and a combined net worth that independent financial estimates place somewhere between $240 million and $413 million. The sheer suggestion that a magical firewall exists between your intimate legislative knowledge and your husband's incredibly lucrative investment decisions requires the American public to suspend reality. It requires them to believe that you go home every single evening, sit across the dinner table from the man you have been deeply bound to for 62 years, and never once casually mention that a $52 billion semiconductor stimulus bill is about to hit the congressional floor. A low, undeniable murmur rippled through the packed gallery. It was the distinct, electric sound that materializes when 400 separate individuals suddenly realize the exact same truth at the exact same moment. I will let the voters decide whether they actually believe that Tulsi continued seamlessly moving forward. July of 2024. Paul Pelosi abruptly sells off between $500,000 and $1 million in Visa stock. Exactly 17 days later, the United States Department of Justice officially announces a massive, unprecedented antitrust lawsuit against Visa. The company's stock plummets 5% almost overnight, but your husband was already safely out of the market. Later that same year, your husband completely liquidates his substantial Microsoft shares. Shortly after that highly convenient sale, the Federal Trade Commission publicly opens an aggressive investigative probe into Microsoft. Once again, safely out of the blast radius before the news ever broke to the public. She turned over a new page. In the year 2024, your family's private investment portfolio generated a staggering return of 54%. The S&P 500, the gold standard benchmark that Ivy League professional fund managers dedicate their entire grueling careers attempting to marginally beat, returned 25%. Your husband did not merely beat the national market, he obliterated it. He doubled it. He significantly outperformed every single major billion-dollar hedge fund operating in America. The financial analyst Grant Cardone recently calculated the math regarding your congressional salary, earning roughly $174,000 annually for 38 years. He concluded that you would literally need to be 33,000 years old to organically accumulate your current level of wealth, relying strictly on a public servant's salary. Someone seated in the back rows let out a sharp gasp of laughter. It was not cruel laughter. It was the laughter of pure, stunned recognition. Furthermore, in May of this current year, an independent stock watchdog agency officially reported that you generated $4.7 million in personal profit during a single day of trading. One single day. The vast majority of hardworking American families will not earn that amount of money in their entire combined lifetimes. She carefully closed the page, folded her hands together, and simply waited. Pelosi leaned aggressively into her microphone. Her vocal tone remained rigidly steady. Trog, it was the exact rehearsed defense she had deployed 100 times before to anchors on CNN, to hosts on MSNBC, to aggressive reporters cornering her in marble hallways, to wealthy donors at exclusive private fundraisers. It was the shield that had always protected her. Director Gabbard, absolutely nothing you have presented here today is new information, and absolutely nothing you have described is illegal in any capacity. My husband is a highly educated, deeply successful private businessman. His financial decisions are entirely his own to make. Every single trade has been thoroughly disclosed under the strict guidelines of the Stock Act. Every single required filing was submitted on time. If you genuinely possess concrete evidence of a criminal act, I strongly suggest you refer your findings directly to the Department of Justice. Tulsi nodded very slowly. You are absolutely correct, Madam Speaker. Everything was eventually disclosed after the massive profits were secured, not before the initial trades were executed. But since you brought it up, let us discuss the exact nature of your timing. She reached deep into the manila folder and extracted a small, black, digital voice recorder. She raised it high into the air so that every single broadcast camera in the room could lock onto it. This device holds a verified audio recording extracted from a telephone call placed between your secure congressional office and your husband's primary investment advisor. The date is December 16th, 2021, exactly 3 days prior to his massive NVIDIA stock purchase. She pressed the play button. The voice that instantly crackled out of the device's tiny speaker was unmistakably clear. 4 decades squarely in the unforgiving public eye meant that every single American citizen recognized that distinct vocal cadence. It was Nancy Pelosi's voice, captured directly from inside her own heavily guarded office. Paul, the Intelligence Committee's classified briefing regarding domestic semiconductors just wrapped up. The CHIPS Act is going to hit the floor for a full vote before the end of March. Ensure you adjust our financial positions before Tuesday's legislative session. Click. 15 agonizing seconds of dead, heavy silence followed. It was the terrifying kind of silence where you can physically hear 300 anxious people refusing to draw breath. Tulsi calmly reached out and stopped the recording. That was your exact voice, Madam Speaker, pulled directly from secure government servers, fully authenticated, precisely time-stamped, legally obtained through a lawful, multi-agency internal review. Pelosi's facial expression remained frozen like carved stone, but her hands, which had been tightly interlaced, involuntarily trembled and shifted toward the hard edge of the mahogany table. Her high-priced defense lawyer from Williams & Connolly leaned over and gently touched her forearm. She violently yanked her arm away. That audio file has been maliciously manipulated. It is a fabricated manipulation. Tulsi's voice remained brutally, surgically level, extracted directly from government servers and fully authenticated by the National Security Agency's Digital Forensics Division. Would you prefer that I play the second recording? The specific audio file regarding the nation of Taiwan? Pelosi said absolutely nothing. Can you possibly explain the miraculous timing, Madam Speaker, 17 days before the crippling visa lawsuit is announced, a mere 3 days after this highly specific phone call regarding NVIDIA? Every single time your husband executes a major financial maneuver, he moves first, and the catastrophic news breaks second. 4 grueling seconds of profound silence descended. Inside a tense congressional hearing room, 4 seconds feels like an eternity. I have definitively answered your question, Director. No, Madam Speaker, you have answered a completely different question, just not the specific one that I asked. The press section was now in an absolute frenzy of scribbling pens and tapping keyboards. 2 prominent reporters were already aggressively filing breaking news alerts directly from their smartphones. Up in the public gallery, a man dressed in a sharp gray suit leaned forward and quietly whispered to the terrified woman seated next to him, "She doesn't have an answer for the timing." He was entirely correct. She did not. And every single soul breathing in that massive room knew it. What unfolded next is the sequence that historians and citizens would analyze far more than the shocking financial numbers, far more than the NSA wiretap recording, far more than the controversial visa liquidation. They would vividly remember the exact moment Tulsi Gabbard completely stopped reading from her prepared documents and began speaking directly from her heart and memory. She calmly pushed the devastating documents off to the side. It was not a grand theatrical gesture. She merely shifted them out of the way, exactly the way one pushes aside an empty plate after finishing a meal. And when she finally raised her eyes, she was no longer looking at Nancy Pelosi. She was staring directly, piercingly into the center broadcast camera. I want to take a moment to tell you a story about a man I had the honor of serving alongside. I have deliberately changed his name to fiercely protect his family's privacy, but I assure you, he is incredibly real, and this tragedy is incredibly real. Sergeant First Class Keone Reyes was assigned to my specific medical unit during my second violent deployment. It was a frontline trauma unit. We spent our days physically processing the broken soldiers who were dragged in from active combat patrols. Devastating IED blast injuries, horrific gunshot wounds, severe heat casualties. The gruesome, bloody realities that you never see broadcast on the evening news because they happen every single day. Keone was undeniably one of the most gifted, dedicated medics I have ever served alongside. He was completely ice cold under enemy fire. He never once complained about the misery. He was the rare caliber of soldier who instantly made every single person around him stronger just by his sheer presence. She paused, taking a slow breath. When we finally rotated back home, he immediately discovered that his young daughter had been officially diagnosed with severe type 1 diabetes while he was deployed overseas fighting for this country. She desperately needed life-saving insulin. Unfortunately, his hard-earned Veterans Affairs benefits were hopelessly delayed due to a massive bureaucratic paperwork backlog. He was forced to pay entirely out of his own pocket, $400 every single month, desperately trying to survive on a modest sergeant's government salary. Her vocal tone had not escalated. She still sounded like a disciplined briefing officer, but something fundamental beneath the surface had violently shifted. It was the ominous way the barometric pressure plummets right before a devastating hurricane makes landfall. I sat quietly with him inside a sweltering parking lot right outside the VA medical clinic in Honolulu. He was aggressively typing math equations into his cracked cell phone, agonizingly trying to balance the soaring cost of his daughter's insulin against his impending monthly rent. A decorated combat medic who had just spent 12 grueling months keeping America's soldiers breathing was now sitting broken in a concrete parking lot, desperately trying to figure out if he could financially afford to keep his own daughter breathing. She slowly turned her hardened gaze back toward Pelosi. During that exact same month, the very same month your husband casually exercised a massive block of NVIDIA call options locked at $12 a share when the actual street market price was soaring at 10 times that amount, the pure, unadulterated profit generated on that single, brilliantly timed transaction was nearly $5 million. The entire room fell utterly dead silent. It was not the standard, polite silence of a legislative hearing, respectfully pausing between inquiries. It was the suffocating, crushing silence of hundreds of people who had just heard two undeniably factual realities placed directly next to each other and simply could not find a moral pathway to make them both acceptable. $5 million secured on one single impeccably timed stock trade, while a decorated soldier who actively bled for his country could not scrape together $400 a month for life-saving medicine. She paused to let the sheer weight of the contrast settle. I am certainly not suggesting that these two isolated events are legally connected. Obviously, they are not. Your husband's wildly lucrative trade was technically legal. Keone's horrific insurance delay was tragically bureaucratic. On a piece of paper, they have absolutely nothing to do with one another. But in the actual breathing, real world, the real world where broken soldiers return home and cannot acquire basic medicine, while their powerful congresswoman's husband rakes in $5 million on a tech stock that magically skyrocketed due to a legislative bill that she personally controlled. In that specific world, Madam Speaker, they have absolutely everything to do with each other. Pelosi's frantic communications director, seated rigidly in the second row, completely stopped typing on her phone. The high-priced attorney from Williams and Connolly slowly placed his expensive fountain pen down onto the table. These were aggressive professionals, highly paid to remain constantly busy. They had entirely stopped being busy. I am deeply sorry for the hardships faced by your military colleague, Pelosi stated. Her voice was noticeably softer now, heavily calculated, meticulously careful. But I must remind you that this particular hearing is strictly focused on congressional stock trading disclosures, not the complexities of military healthcare administration. It is fundamentally about trust, Madam Speaker. Tulsi's voice was quiet, almost deceptively gentle, which somehow made the verbal strike infinitely worse. It is entirely about whether the hard-working American people can actually trust that the elite individuals who write our federal laws are not privately hoarding massive profits from those exact same laws. And right now, sitting here today, the undeniable answer is no. Nobody dared to speak. Not the committee chairman, not the attending members of Congress, not the packed public gallery. The singular echoing sound in the massive room was the frantic, rhythmic scratching of the court stenographer's mechanical keys, permanently recording every single damning syllable for an official public transcript that would ultimately be downloaded 400,000 times before the stroke of midnight. This was the exact crystalline moment that political historians would later pinpoint as the turning point that permanently changed everything. Not merely because of the staggering financial numbers, but because of the suffocating silence that immediately followed. The profound silence of 300 human beings who had just been forcefully shown the true, agonizing human cost of a $280 million fortune. However, insider trading is actually not the most severe allegation contained within this folder, Madam Speaker. The room, which had been slowly, gratefully exhaling after the devastating emotional weight of the insulin story, instantly went rigid all over again. Tulsi reached methodically back into the folder and produced a stiff document prominently bearing the unmistakable, classified seal of the National Security Council. The sensitive classification markings had been heavily redacted with thick black ink, but the authoritative government seal was glaringly obvious. Let us pivot and discuss the sovereign nation of Taiwan. Pelosi's attorney forcefully leaned forward into his microphone. Mr. Chairman, if this line of questioning involves active classified intelligence. Officially declassified, Tulsi aggressively interrupted as of last Tuesday afternoon. It is remarkably funny how the system works when necessary. She slapped the heavy document flat against the table. August 2020, you authorized a highly publicized flight to Taiwan in direct, arrogant defiance of the explicit strategic advice provided by the Pentagon, the United States State Department, the National Security Council, and the sitting president of the United States. Every single top-tier military advisor warned you that your diplomatic visit would instantly trigger a severe geopolitical crisis with mainland China. Every single daily intelligence briefing aggressively warned of impending hostile missile tests, massive military naval exercises, the highly probable closure of critical international shipping lanes, and guaranteed severe global market volatility. You stubbornly went anyway. She locked eyes with Pelosi. Why? Pelosi defensively straightened her posture in her leather chair. That diplomatic trip was entirely focused on fiercely defending global democracy and protecting Taiwanese national sovereignty against unprovoked Chinese aggression. Then explain exactly why your husband rapidly purchased millions in defense contractors, alternative maritime shipping companies, and rare earth mineral suppliers, exactly 3 weeks before your taxpayer-funded jet ever left the tarmac. The devastating question landed in the center of the room like a live fragmentation grenade. Pelosi's jaw opened, snapped closed, and slowly opened again. No sound emerged. I possess right here a formerly classified intelligence briefing summary, now fully declassified, officially dated July 11th, 2022, precisely 3 weeks prior to your highly controversial Taiwan trip. The detailed briefing outlined exactly, down to the tactical level, how Beijing would aggressively respond to a high-level American diplomatic visit. Immediate ballistic missile tests near the Taiwanese coast, large-scale, hostile military naval exercises. Extreme market volatility severely impacting the semiconductor industry and major defense stocks. Massive potential disruption to all Pacific maritime shipping. Tulsi slid the damning intelligence briefing summary directly next to Paul Pelosi's official Wall Street trading records. Every single predicted geopolitical response, every single specific stock your husband massively purchased. It is an absolutely flawless one-to-one match. He did not merely harbor a lucky hunch that a global crisis was brewing. He knew exactly, precisely what flavor of crisis was coming because you illegally told him, because you held the highly classified briefing documents in your own hands. She dramatically rotated the document so the massive bank of broadcast cameras could clearly capture the text. Your husband's financial portfolio was meticulously positioned to massively profit from a direct military confrontation between two heavily armed nuclear powers. This was not a savvy Wall Street market hunch. It was not an educated, lucky guess. It was a classified, top-secret government prediction detailing exactly what chaos would unfold and exactly how to privately profit from the impending bloodshed. She reached down and retrieved the black digital voice recorder for a second time. There happens to be a second authenticated audio recording originating from the exact same secure congressional phone line dated July 14th, 2022, exactly 18 days before your plane departed for your Taiwan trip. She firmly pressed play. It was Pelosi's voice once again, cutting through the silence. Paul, the geopolitical situation surrounding Taiwan is about to get incredibly hot. Intelligence shows Beijing is aggressively planning massive military exercises in direct response to our new semiconductor export restrictions. Ensure that you are correctly positioned heavily in major defense contractors and regional stability market plays. And Paul, ensure you completely delete these specific calls from the digital log. The hearing room was so paralyzingly silent that the subtle hum of the overhead air conditioning vents sounded like a roaring jet turbine. Ensure you completely delete these specific calls from the digital log. Tulsi coldly repeated the damning phrase. You explicitly knew that your actions needed to be completely hidden. You verbalized it yourself. On a secure, monitored government telephone line that the National Security Agency was actively recording. She placed the heavy digital recorder back down onto the desk. While you were comfortably flying first class to Taiwan to secure your heavily orchestrated political photo opportunity, a close personal friend of mine was actively stationed at Kadena Air Base located in Okinawa. He explicitly told me that the very second your diplomatic plane officially entered highly contested Taiwanese airspace, his entire combat unit was immediately elevated to DEFCON maximum readiness. His terrified wife was sitting at home in cramped military base housing along with their 2 young children. She was unable to sleep for 3 agonizing days. She had an emergency evacuation go bag fully packed and sitting by the front door. That dedicated military spouse was frantically preparing to evacuate her small children because of an international military crisis that you deliberately planned for. You did not plan to prevent it. You meticulously planned to privately profit from it. Tulsi's voice finally began to rise, sharp and heavy with righteous fury. That is not merely illegal insider trading. That is not standard political corruption. That is an absolute, unforgivable betrayal of every single man and woman who has ever proudly worn this great country's military uniform, trusting blindly that the powerful elites operating in Washington would not casually gamble with their actual lives just to line their own pockets with money. Pelosi blindly reached out for her crystal water glass. Her hand was violently shaking. It was undeniably visible on every high-definition camera in the room. The clear water violently sloshed over the delicate rim and pooled onto the polished mahogany table. She shakily placed the glass back down without ever taking a sip. Her panicked lawyer desperately tried to lean in and whisper a piece of legal advice. She aggressively shoved his shoulder away. That diplomatic trip was entirely about bravely standing up to the totalitarian regime of China. Pelosi stammered defensively. That diplomatic trip made your husband over $3 million in pure profit in exactly 2 weeks. If that is your definition of standing up to China, Madam Speaker, your private investment portfolio holds a remarkably interesting definition of American patriotism. Pelosi desperately opened her mouth to strike back, but then clamped it shut. For the absolute first time in 40 dominant years of American public life, her own physical body was aggressively betraying her. The massive television cameras, every single one of them operating in the room, zoomed in incredibly tight on her trembling, age-spotted hands. The single most powerful, influential woman in all of Washington politics, and her hands simply would not stop, violently shaking. The visibly overwhelmed committee chairman forcefully slammed his gavel, immediately calling for an emergency 5-minute recess to restore order. He might as well have stood up and called for a mutual ceasefire in a brutal war that had already been decisively lost. Nancy Pelosi's legendary political career possessed exactly 23 minutes of life left. She simply had not realized it yet. When the chaotic hearing finally reconvened, 2 prominent seats located on the Democratic side of the elevated dais were glaringly empty. Nobody bothered to explain exactly where those allied members had suddenly vanished to. Nobody truly needed to ask. Tulsi reached down and picked up the absolute final printed document remaining in her folder. This is a newly drafted piece of legislation currently introduced by Senator Josh Hawley. It is officially titled the Pelosi Act, the Preventing Elected Leaders from Owning Securities and Investments Act. She allowed the devastating acronym to hang heavily in the stale air. The United States Congress literally named a massive anti-corruption legislative bill directly after you, Madam Speaker. Not the standard stock trading reform act, not the generic congressional ethics and transparency bill. It is explicitly named after you, personally, because your brazen trading activity has become so widely notorious, so incredibly brazen, that your very last name is now culturally synonymous with the entire systemic problem. Senator Josh Hawley, a staunch Republican. Senator Bernie Sanders, a fiercely progressive independent. Senator John Fetterman, a mainstream Democrat. Three powerful men who agree on absolutely nothing in politics magically agreed on this one specific issue. What you have been doing in the dark needs to immediately stop. Tulsi leaned forward slightly. And it is not merely isolated to the halls of Congress. There are highly popular mobile applications, actual financial software programs downloaded by millions that blast automatic push notifications directly to amateur investors every single time your husband executes a massive trade. Tens of thousands of regular citizens pay monthly subscription money simply to instantly copy your exact investment portfolio. There is a fully functioning exchange-traded fund operating on the market with the specific ticker symbol NANC that legally tracks Democratic congressional insider trades. It is massively outperforming the broader market. The American people have literally transformed your blatant corruption into a highly lucrative financial product. They have entirely given up on the naive idea that you will ever voluntarily stop. So they have cynically decided to personally profit from it alongside you instead. That is not congressional oversight, Madam Speaker. That is absolute societal surrender. She flipped to the final page. In the year 2011, the investigative program 60 Minutes broadcast a massive expose regarding rampant congressional insider trading. You were prominently featured in the segment. The legendary journalist Steve Croft asked you directly, on camera, whether you possessed an unfair financial advantage. You confidently answered no. You stared directly into his eyes on national television and said no. In 2012, Congress officially passed the Stock Act, theoretically designed to permanently prevent exactly this specific flavor of predatory trading. You proudly voted for its passage. You stood beaming at the official presidential signing ceremony. You smiled brightly for the flashing press cameras. And in the 13 years since that precise moment, the 13 years since that exact law was explicitly supposed to halt your actions, your family's personal net worth skyrocketed from $31 million to somewhere well north of $280 million. You proudly voted for the law. You happily posed for the historical photo, and then you deliberately treated it like the firing of a starting gun. She took a slow, deep breath. In 2025, the sitting president of the United States stood powerfully before a joint session of Congress and aggressively called for the immediate passage of the Stop Insider Trading Act. He stared out directly at the crowded chamber and loudly stated, and I am quoting his exact words, "Let us ensure that sitting members of Congress cannot corruptly profit from closely held insider information." Members from both political parties eagerly stood up and delivered thunderous applause. Then the president boldly went off script and asked the entire nation, "Did Nancy Pelosi stand up?" "I highly doubt it." Tulsi locked eyes with the shaken woman across from her. "Did you actually stand up, Madam Speaker?" "Pelosi found her voice, though it was weak. I proudly stood. I loudly applauded. And I will fiercely continue to support maximum legislative transparency, then forcefully put your vast assets into a fully blind trust. Today, right now, end this charade." You could permanently silence every single lingering question regarding NVIDIA and Visa and Microsoft with one simple legal signature. You have been repeatedly asked to do exactly this for 13 agonizing years by investigative reporters, by your political colleagues, even by your own dedicated staff behind closed doors. And you have stubbornly, arrogantly refused every single time. Why? The answer is simple. Because a blind trust legally means you cannot see the daily trades, and you cannot massively profit from information that you cannot see. Pelosi said absolutely nothing. Her silence was a suffocating blanket over the room. And then something occurred that absolutely no one in the sprawling capital city of Washington had anticipated. A veteran Democratic congressman slowly stood up from his leather chair. Mike Thompson, representing the state of California. He had faithfully sat squarely behind Nancy Pelosi for 12 years. He had loyally voted in lockstep with her on every major piece of legislation. He had fiercely defended her honor on combative cable news panels. He had publicly referred to her as his guiding mentor. Mr. Chairman, his voice was noticeably shaking. The chaotic room instantly dropped into absolute terrifying silence. Mainstream Democrats do not ever break ranks against Nancy Pelosi. That was the unwritten, unbreakable rule of the Capitol. For 40 years, that was the only political rule that truly mattered. I need to say something publicly. I actively voted against massive Stock Act reform 3 separate times simply because House leadership forcefully asked me to do so, because she personally asked me to do so. She called my office personally. She warned me that supporting reform would severely damage the party's fundraising apparatus. She repeatedly assured me that the questionable trades were entirely legal and that the aggressive media cycle would quickly move on. He slowly turned his head to look directly down at Pelosi. His eyes were visibly wet with emotion.
The media did not move on. The hardworking American people did not move on. And I deeply regret that I ever listened to those assurances.
The good people of California's 4th Congressional District sent me to this building to serve their interests, not to blindly protect anyone's massively inflated investment portfolio. I am profoundly ashamed that I did not find the courage to say this years ago, but I am loudly saying it right now. He heavily sat back down. His aging hands were shaking almost as violently as Pelosi's. The sprawling hearing room collectively held its breath. In 40 brutal years of cutthroat congressional politics, Nancy Pelosi had never, not even a single time, been publicly, aggressively betrayed by a sitting member of her own loyal caucus on live national television. She had survived vicious Republican attack ads, sprawling media investigations, and brutal presidential confrontations. She had never been violently stabbed in the back by her own heavily guarded side. Not once, not ever. Until this very second, she slowly turned her neck to look up at Thompson, and the agonizing expression painted across her face, which the high-definition broadcast cameras captured perfectly, and which political analysts would obsessively dissect frame by frame for weeks, was not one of burning anger. It was not burning contempt. It was pure, unadulterated, unprocessed shock. It was the horrifying face of an entrenched queen helplessly watching her most loyal Praetorian guard slowly turn his sharpened sword around to face her. I have proudly served this great country for 38 years, Pelosi began, her legendary voice audibly cracking and breaking for the first time in modern memory. And you are going to leave this Congress exactly $277 million richer than the day you first arrived. Tulsi instantly fired back, her voice ringing like a struck bell, all while surviving on a taxpayer salary of $174,000 a year. That is not public service, Madam Speaker. That is predatory commerce. Pelosi fiercely gripped the edge of the heavy wooden table, her knuckles flushed completely white under the strain. She desperately tried to force herself to stand up. It was a primal, ingrained instinct forged from 40 years of wielding absolute power, some deep reflex screaming at her to stand tall, seize control of the narrative, and dominate the hostile room. Her legs absolutely refused to cooperate. She collapsed heavily back down into her leather chair. The heavy chair violently scraped against the polished floor, generating a harsh, grating sound that the ultra-sensitive microphones perfectly picked up. It was a sound that would be digitally replayed 10 million times across social media platforms before the sun even rose the next morning. Her panicked lawyer desperately reached out for her arm once again. This time, she did not arrogantly pull away. She desperately needed the physical support, and every single soul watching in the room could clearly see the devastating collapse. The investigative hearing had been officially scheduled to last for 3 hours. They were now aggressively pushing deep into the fourth. The overwhelmed committee chairman had completely abandoned any lingering pretense that he was actually in control of the spiraling situation. Live online streaming viewership had just rocketed past 800,000 concurrent watchers, an absolute shattering record for any standard congressional committee hearing. A frantic staffer rushed over and quietly whispered to the chairman that the White House had already frantically called the switchboard twice. Tulsi methodically closed the manila folder. She calmly set it aside. When she finally looked back up, her steady hands were resting completely flat on the wooden table. There was absolutely nothing left in them. There was nothing remaining between her and the hot microphone. I want to conclude this session with something that has absolutely nothing to do with volatile stocks or lucrative trades or suspicious timelines. The atmospheric pressure in the room visibly shifted. Everyone present physically felt it the profound way a crowded space transforms when a brutal technical argument suddenly elevates into a profound moral reckoning. On January 3rd, 1987, you proudly raised your right hand and solemnly swore a sacred oath to fiercely support and defend the Constitution of the United States. You were exactly 46 years old. You were a mother raising 5 children. You genuinely believed in something greater than yourself. I genuinely believe that you meant every word of that sacred oath, Madam Speaker. I truly believe that the ambitious woman who stood proudly in that grand chamber back in 1987 genuinely wanted to serve the public. Tulsi's voice dropped, carrying a heavy, undeniable sorrow. But somewhere in the dark decades between that day and this moment, something fundamental broke. Something changed. I do not know the exact lucrative trade, or the exact compromised vote, or the exact quiet moment when that sacred oath stopped being a solemn promise and mutated into nothing more than a tedious formality. But the financial math is brutally, undeniably clear. She locked her hardened eyes squarely onto Pelosi. You first entered the United States Congress holding a personal net worth of roughly $3 million. You are going to leave this historic institution wielding a vast net worth soaring north of $280 million. That staggering sum is not the result of a modest congressional salary. That is not the result of a comfortable government pension. That is certainly not the result of a lucrative publishing book deal. That obscene fortune is exactly what happens when an individual spends 4 entire decades operating directly at the corrupt intersection of highly classified information and massive corporate money, and arrogantly treats the ethical distance between the two as nothing more than a casual suggestion. Tulsi slowly stood up, her posture impossibly rigid. I personally took my sacred oath twice, once when I entered Congress and once when I entered the United States Army. That second military oath did not come comfortably packaged with a massive, lucrative stock portfolio. It came with a violent deployment to the burning deserts of Iraq, a rigid steel bunk bed, and a canvas rucksack that weighed exactly 65 pounds. You served 38 comfortable years walking the gilded halls of Congress. I served 3 brutal deployments operating inside an active combat zone. You are leaving your powerful office worth $280 million. I left the blood-stained sands of Iraq carrying nothing but a combat medical badge and a canvas duffel bag. The silence was deafening. The fundamental difference between the two of us is not about our political party. It is not about our differing ideologies. It is certainly not about our age. The fundamental difference between us is price. Everything of value that I possess, I physically carried through the fire. Everything of value that you possess, you corruptly traded away. She stood fully upright, pushing her chair back. Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have absolutely nothing further to add. She calmly picked up the simple manila folder, the very folder she had not actually needed to reference for the past 20 devastating minutes, and began a slow, deliberate walk toward the heavy oak exit doors. Behind her, the massive public gallery erupted in an absolute frenzy. It was not the standard, hesitant, polite, smattering of applause, typical of a dry congressional hearing, the standard. It was a raw, visceral roar. It was the undeniable sound of 300 overwhelmed citizens who had been suffocatingly holding their breath for 4 agonizing hours and had finally, miraculously, been granted permission to violently exhale. The overwhelmed chairman desperately slammed his wooden gavel once, twice, 3 rapid times. It was entirely useless. Some roaring sounds are simply vastly larger and more powerful than a piece of wood. Nancy Pelosi remained frozen in her leather chair. She did not twitch. Her panicked attorney was aggressively snapping his expensive leather briefcase shut. Her frantic communications director was already sprinting into the marble hallway, her cell phone jammed aggressively against her ear, desperately screaming the word reframe into every single panicked sentence. Pelosi slowly, agonizingly tried to stand up. Her legs brutally failed her yet again. The lawyer hastily grabbed her right arm. A terrified junior staffer rushed over and grabbed her left. Broadcast live on national television to a rapidly climbing audience of over 800,000 shocked viewers. The single most powerful, invincible woman in the history of Washington politics had to be physically hoisted and carried out of her own throne. She managed exactly 3 shaky steps before she abruptly stopped and slowly turned her head back toward the chaotic room. The high-definition cameras perfectly captured her devastated face. And what was permanently etched onto it was not fiery anger. It was not stubborn defiance. It was certainly not the arrogant, predatory smile she had worn like armor when she confidently marched into the room 4 hours earlier. It was the haunting face of a broken woman who had just helplessly watched 40 years of absolute, unquestioned power violently collapse into dust in a mere 4 hours. She understood with absolutely chilling clarity that nothing she had ever painstakingly built could possibly survive the devastation that had just been unleashed. She slowly turned away. Her panicked staff forcefully guided her toward the massive exit doors. She did not utilize the discreet side entrance. Nancy Pelosi never utilized side entrances, not even on the very last humiliating day of her political career. The digital clip absolutely shattered the internet well before the lunch hour even hit. It wasn't the powerful final speech about the dual oaths. It wasn't even the heartbreaking story about the soldiers' insulin. It wasn't even the massive treasonous revelation regarding the Taiwan trip, although the chilling audio recording of Pelosi's voice explicitly ordering her husband to adjust our positions before Tuesday's vote would rapidly become the absolute most replayed piece of audio in the entire history of the C-SPAN network within a mere 48 hours. The specific video clip that achieved massive viral liftoff, the one that instantly morphed into a global GIF, an inescapable meme, the exact video your distant uncle texted you at 11 o'clock at night with absolutely no context attached, was the brutal exchange regarding the timing from the second chapter of the hearing. Can you possibly explain the miraculous timing? 17 days. Pelosi's trembling hands desperately moving toward the edge of the mahogany table. I have definitively answered your question, Director. No, Madam Speaker, you have answered a completely different question, just not the specific one that I asked. The clip rocketed to 26 million explosive views in exactly 48 hours. A creative college student living in Arizona digitally auto-tuned the exchange into a rhythmic beat. That specific video racked up 11 million views. A prominent hyper-analytical financial creator on YouTube released a deep dive video meticulously breaking down every single Pelosi stock trade side by side with major legislative events. He simply titled the video 17 Days. It generated 9 million views. The popular Pelosi Tracker mobile application officially reported a staggering 300% overnight surge in rapid downloads. And then, for the absolute first time in 3 highly profitable years, the app reported an unprecedented 300% surge in angry deletions. The American people no longer wanted to playfully follow her trades. They wanted her to be aggressively prosecuted by the federal government. The audio leak regarding the Taiwan trip was somehow even more explosive. Delete these calls from the log, instantly transformed into its own massive trending hashtag within less than 24 hours. A furious graphic designer operating out of Brooklyn had heavily distributed a stark digital poster, a high-contrast image of Pelosi's devastated face, a faded American flag hanging in the background, and 6 heavy, blood-red words printed underneath. Delete these calls from the log. It was illegally downloaded and reprinted over 2 million times. Fox News made the unprecedented decision to broadcast the entire unedited closing speech in its entirety. Sean Hannity refused to add his standard fiery commentary. He simply aired the raw footage, allowing the live camera to hold tight on his stunned face for a prolonged, silent moment. That, he finally whispered into the microphone, is exactly why she left their corrupt party. And that is exactly why they are absolutely terrified of her. Conservative commentator Ben Shapiro publicly labeled the event the single most devastatingly effective congressional testimony in modern American history, specifically noting with awe that Gabbard had never once needed to raise her vocal tone. She absolutely didn't need to, he stated bluntly. She brought the irrefutable receipts. Tucker Carlson completely hijacked his programming, dedicating 3 consecutive broadcast nights entirely to dissecting the hearing. Night 1 focused purely on the devastating financial trades. Night 2 ripped into the horrifying Taiwan betrayal. Night 3 featured an exclusive, explosive interview with a highly decorated, retired NSA intelligence analyst who firmly confirmed that the leaked phone recordings were absolutely consistent with standard, highly classified government intercept protocols. The grim-faced analyst added on live television, if a uniformed military officer had ever been caught making those exact phone calls, they would currently be rotting in a concrete cell at Fort Leavenworth. CNN's blaring homepage headline read, Pelosi has no answer for the timing question. Even left-leaning MSNBC was forced to lead their primetime coverage with Gabbard presents damaging evidence of Pelosi trading patterns. President Donald Trump aggressively posted on his Truth Social platform at precisely 12:47 p.m. Tulsi was absolutely incredible today. Nancy got completely destroyed. The Pelosi Act must be passed immediately. She has been viciously ripping off the great American people for decades. Everyone always knew it. Now everyone finally saw it. Sad. Pelosi's reeling congressional office finally managed to release an official statement at exactly 3 p.m. It consisted of exactly 3 sterile, clinical sentences. Today's highly irregular hearing was nothing more than a desperately politically motivated exercise specifically designed to distract the public from the current administration's glaring legislative failures. Speaker Emerita Pelosi has fully and consistently complied with all legal disclosure requirements throughout her entire storied career and will fiercely continue to advocate for the good people of San Francisco. The brutal public reaction ratio on social media was an apocalyptic 8,000 negative comments to 1 single like. Democratic Party leadership desperately convened an emergency, highly secure conference call at exactly 4 p.m. Hakeem Jeffries, Catherine Clark, and every single top-tier member of the leadership apparatus actively participated in the panic. The entire frantic call lasted a mere 11 minutes. Hakeem Jeffries publicly released a devastating statement at 4:30 p.m. The grave allegations presented today under oath are incredibly serious and absolutely warrant a thorough, transparent investigation by the appropriate federal law enforcement authorities. We strongly call for full, unwavering transparency and total accountability from every single sitting member of Congress. The political translation was brutal and absolute. Nancy Pelosi had been violently cut loose. She was entirely on her own. 3 prominent Democratic congressmen who had aggressively, publicly defended Pelosi's controversial trading record for years suddenly uniformly declined to offer any comment to the press. A 4th representative, speaking strictly under the cloak of anonymity to an aggressive reporter at the Washington Post, confessed, that brutal story about the soldiers' insulin completely killed us. You simply cannot try to politically explain away $5 million in rapid profit when a decorated soldier cannot even afford his basic medicine. That is not a nuanced policy argument anymore. That is a devastating Republican campaign commercial. We simply cannot afford to air that commercial to protect her anymore. A 5th high-ranking Democrat, also speaking strictly on background, bitterly added, all she ever needed to do was simply announce she was putting everything into a blind trust. That is literally all she ever had to do. We practically begged her on our knees to do it. For years, she arrogantly refused to do it. And now, every single one of us is going to heavily pay the political price for her greed. Senator Josh Hawley organized a massive impromptu press conference at 5 p.m. The highly anticipated Pelosi Act had miraculously gained 6 powerful new co-sponsors in the few short hours since the explosive hearing concluded. 3 prominent Democrats, 3 prominent Republicans. Director Gabbard achieved something today that we have been desperately trying to accomplish for years, Hawley stated fiercely into a sea of microphones. She made it absolutely impossible for the American public to ever look away again. Senator Rick Scott forcefully tweeted a single ominous sentence. The GAO federal audit officially begins tomorrow morning. The Federal Bureau of Investigation unexpectedly issued a rare public statement at exactly 6 p.m. The Bureau is currently aggressively reviewing all provided materials related to potential severe violations of federal securities law, actively involving both current and former members of the United States Congress and their immediate family members. The Securities and Exchange Commission immediately announced the launch of an aggressive, immediate federal investigation, actively looking into highly suspicious trading patterns, heavily correlated with top secret classified briefing schedules. By the stroke of midnight, 3 unprecedented historical events had occurred that had never, ever transpired before in the long, blood-stained history of American politics. First, a sitting, highly powerful member of Congress had their massive personal stock trades placed under a brutal, simultaneous investigation by the FBI, the SEC, and the GAO, entirely based on damning evidence directly presented during a live congressional hearing. Second, a loyal, veteran member of the powerful Speaker's own political party had publicly, aggressively broken ranks with her on live national television, tearfully apologizing to his own voters for ever blindly following her corrupt lead. Third, over 800,000 American citizens had willingly tuned in to watch a dry legislative committee hearing live on the internet, a massive, staggering audience, far larger than most primetime cable news programs, managed to draw in an entire week. Tulsi Gabbard finally landed at Joint Base Andrews late that evening. She quietly drove herself all the way back to her modest 2-bedroom home located deep in Northern Virginia. Her husband, Abraham, was sitting quietly in the softly lit living room. How did it go? She, exhausted, set her canvas bag down heavily onto the kitchen counter. She couldn't find the exact words to adequately explain the chilling reality of 17 days. I saw that the video clip is absolutely everywhere, he offered. I know, I turned my phone completely off right at noon. She sank, exhausted, into a chair at the small kitchen table. The heavy manila folder was still resting silently inside her bag. She didn't bother to pull it out. She had all the devastating numbers permanently memorized. Not the exact closing stock prices, not the specific profit percentages, but the agonizing, bleeding gap. The horrifying gap between what the United States Congress was originally intended to be and the corrupt, hollow shell it had ultimately become. She confidently called me a one-percenter, Tulsi whispered quietly into the quiet room, right before the entire spectacle started, right in front of every single camera. She arrogantly told me that I wasn't remotely qualified to be sitting in that room. Did that actually bother you?
No. What genuinely bothered me was the terrible reality of the insulin.
Keone's sick daughter desperately needing $400 a month to survive, and Pelosi's husband casually raking in $5 million on a single, perfectly timed afternoon trade. She turned her head to look out the kitchen window, watching the warm, orange streetlights slowly flickering to life, one by one, down the quiet street. She has been entrenched in that building for 38 long years, Abe, and she somehow magically went from $3 million to $280 million. And the entire time, everyone just sat there and watched her do it. Everyone in that city absolutely knew, and absolutely nobody possessed the courage to do a single thing about it. And now, the brutal math is permanently broadcast on C-SPAN. And basic math absolutely does not care how powerful you think you are. Far away in San Francisco, sitting silently in a towering glass brokerage firm located right downtown, a 31-year-old financial analyst was staring blankly at a glowing push notification violently flashing across his computer screen. He had religiously followed the notorious Pelosi tracker application for 3 highly lucrative years. He had painstakingly built massive, complex Excel spreadsheets tracking her every move. He had made very real, very serious money copying her corruption, more than enough money to finally place a substantial down payment on a luxury apartment in the city. The glowing alert read, "New C filing, Pelosi, Paul sale, NVIDIA, $1 million to $5 million." He just sat there, completely frozen, staring at the flashing digital words. For the absolute first time in 3 highly profitable years, he did not frantically rush to copy the corrupt trade. Instead, he slowly reached out, permanently closed the tracking application, opened a fresh blank internet browser, quietly typed the words standard index fund, and finally started over.